The field of nutrition is filled with population-based studies, and part of that is because it's incredibly difficult to do a randomized controlled study. Especially when it comes to talking about things like weight loss, the debate is endless. What diet is better, a low carbohydrate or a low-fat diet? Well, let's take a look at a really well-designed, randomized controlled trial looking to answer the question of what works better for weight loss. A whole foods plant-based diet that is low in fat, or an animal-based ketogenic diet that is low in carbohydrates, high in fat. Before we get started, as always, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I would love to hear your comments below. Before jumping into the research, it's important to define what a ketogenic and a plant-based diet is. There are so many variable definitions, so we want to be on the same page, starting with the data. So when you talk about a classic ketogenic diet, that's the one that's really the 4:1:1 ratio. That's another way of saying that the fat content is 4 times as compared to the protein content or the carbohydrate content. Then there's another variety which is called the modified Atkins diet. And what that allows you to do is to have a little bit more freedom in this form of protein. So therefore, the ratio for fat to carbohydrates and protein is 1:1. Then you have the low glycemic index treatment. And in this particular case, you're allowed to have a little bit more carbohydrates. It's about 40 to 60 grams per day. But these carbohydrates are the low glycemic index, specifically less than 50. And the fat content is about 60%, and you're dealing with about 20 to 30% protein. Finally, you have the variance. And that's essentially a way of saying that you can add things like ketone esters or salts or medium chain triglycerides. And the hope there is that all of those things will help you to get to ketosis faster. How about looking at the definition of a plant-based diet? Starting with the flexitarian diet, that's where the foundation is still a whole foods plant-based diet. On top of that, it could include things like eggs, dairy, occasionally meat, chicken, fish, or other seafood. Pescatarian is mainly a whole foods plant-based diet, but in addition to that, fish is included. Sometimes it can include things like dairy along with that and other stuff, but usually it includes no other meats and no poultry. Vegetarian, there's a couple of different types. There can be lacto-ovo, which is they'll be okay with drinking dairy or milk, and ovo meaning eggs, or either one, lacto or ovo by itself. But it does not include any fish, does not include any poultry, does not include any meat. Then there's the vegan, which includes no animal foods. But remember, a whole foods, low-fat, minimally processed, plant-based diet is what you ought to strive for. The closer down the spectrum you get, the healthier you're going to be. All right, now let's get into the research. So here is a randomized control study in which they were looking at the effects of a low-fat, plant-based, minimally processed diet against an animal-based, low-carbohydrate, high-fat ketogenic diet. And what they told the participants were that they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. The participants who entered this study were told this was not a weight loss study. Now, before we look at the methods and the results of the study, it's important to understand 2 classic models when we look at weight gain. The first one is the carbohydrate-insulin model, and it kind of goes something like this. The concept is that high carbohydrate diets will lead to an excess in insulin secretion. That insulin will lead to the energy that you're getting to be shuttled into fat stores. And the individuals will have increased hunger, and they will also expend less energy or burn less energy. So as a result, eating a high carbohydrate diet leads to more fat buildup, you get hungrier, and you expend less energy, and therefore you gain weight. That is the definition of the carbohydrate-insulin model. Now there's one more model, and that is the passive overconsumption of energy model. And this one, the theory goes something like this. As you eat high-fat foods, you end up increasing energy intake because they're so calorie or energy dense, and you might not realize how much you're actually consuming. In addition, because they have a weak effect on satiety or fullness, you may not feel full and you may end up consuming too much energy, and hence eating high-fat foods will cause you to gain weight. So both of these models essentially try to explain how eating high carbohydrate-rich foods or eating high-fat foods, both of them supposedly cause an increase in weight gain. Let's see if that holds true or not in this research. So in this particular study, the researchers started with essentially 20 non-diabetic healthy adults. Now this is a crossover study, so essentially all of those 20 adults got exposed to both arms. So they would start randomly assigned with either an animal-based low-carbohydrate ketogenic arm, which we'll call the low-carb arm, and that was 10% carbohydrate and 75% fat. The other arm was the plant-based, low-fat diet, which was the opposite. It was 75% carbohydrates and 10% fat. Now, what's important to remember in both of these arms is that both of the diets were low in ultra-processed foods. So when we talk about carbs, we're not talking about junk foods. Also, they matched both of the groups to make sure they both had the same type of non-starchy vegetables. More importantly, the reason I like this study so much is because they really designed the study well. In fact, they made sure that the participants were getting weighed daily. They had their vital signs checked daily. They put accelerometers on them so they could see how much they're moving. This way, if it looked like they were losing weight, we could tell if it was because they were moving more or it was truly because of an impact of a dietary intervention. And then they also had them wear continuous glucose meters throughout. And what that did was help us to see what the sugars were like throughout different periods. And finally, 1 day per week, they had them sit in a respiratory chamber to measure their energy expenditure so we could tell what kind of energy they were expending based on the diet arm they were in. All right, so let's start with the results. What did they find? Well, starting with energy intake, what they showed was that the folks in the low-fat arm, remember that's the low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet arm, in the low-fat arm were consuming close to almost 700 calories less than the low-carb diet arm over the 2 weeks. In fact, this thing stayed consistent throughout the study, even when there was a crossover design. Then they looked at hunger. Now, this was really fascinating because what they showed was that there was no significant differences in hunger, in satisfaction, in fullness, or in eating capacity, both in the low carbohydrate and the low fat arm. So if you look at the last point we made, which is that the low fat arm was eating close to 700 calories less, and they didn't feel any hungrier, that's a really key point, that you could follow a low fat, high carbohydrate diet and have it not affect your hunger intake and naturally cut down your calories. Now, what about weight loss? Well, here was interesting because in the low carb group, they had more weight loss, 1.77 kilograms versus 1.09 kilograms in the low fat. What was interesting was the type of weight loss that they had. So in the low carb arm, they had more fat-free weight loss, which means it wasn't fat. It was other things. What other things could it be? It can be muscle loss. It can be water weight that you're losing. Versus in the low fat diet arm, they had more fat mass change or fat loss. And hence, not only did they have a calorie reduction, their hunger didn't change, but they also had a reduction in fat mass. But when the researchers looked at the sugar levels on the continuous glucose monitoring, what they showed was that the mean glucose levels, especially after eating, were much higher in the low-fat arm than they were in the low-carbohydrate arm. And the question becomes is what is the impact of that? The study is only 2 weeks, so it's hard to tell. But interestingly enough, they also looked at insulin levels, and same exact thing. In the low-fat arm, there was higher amount of insulin because there was higher amount of glucose there to match that. But what was really interesting when they looked at the low-fat and low-carb was what happened if they gave them an oral glucose challenge. In other words, if they gave them some sugar water to drink, what happened to both their glucose and their insulin? So what they found was that in the low-carb arm, their sugar actually shot up a lot more than the low-fat, but the insulin secretion stayed the same. So what you're seeing is for the same amount of insulin, the glucose is much higher. In other words, you are developing insulin resistance in as short as 2 weeks of following a low carbohydrate diet. Or in other words, it's the body's adaptation to the low carbohydrate diet that's already starting to result. So when you add sugars back to the system, your body has a hard time dealing with that. Okay, so let's kind of look at both of these arms and see what were the pros and cons in each. So in the low carbohydrate arm, which is, remember, the low carbohydrate, animal-based, ketogenic diet arm, what was interesting was that after a meal, the sugars were lower. And same thing with the insulin levels if you compare that to the low-fat arm. So you got lower sugars, you got lower insulin being secreted compared to the low-fat arm. But if you gave them a glucose challenge, what you saw was they already started to have impaired glucose tolerance. There was higher sugar that was in the blood because the insulin had a hard time getting it out of the blood. One of the things that they also looked at that was mentioned was uric acid levels. Now, uric acid levels are linked to gout. There's thought process that may be linked to heart disease, and it may be linked to kidney disease. Now, these are controversial as studies point one way or the other. With a ketogenic diet, there was an increase by 35% in the folks in that arm for their uric acid levels. Then when they looked at their triglyceride levels, now triglycerides are linked to heart disease, but it's a very weak link. There were lower fasting triglycerides. So at their baseline, they had lower triglycerides. And of course, if they ate their meals, which were mostly fat, they had higher triglycerides postprandial. On the flip side, you have the low-fat plant-based diet. What was interesting here was the energy intake was lower by 500 to 700 calories per day. Not only that, they had greater fat loss instead of the fat-free mass that was lost. And while that fat was being lost, they didn't have a change in their hunger. So in other words, they cut down their calories and their hunger did not increase. And so it's more likely that they're able to maintain this lifestyle. So really, what is the bottom line that you can walk away with this? First, we mentioned two models of obesity. The carbohydrate-insulin model, that if you eat carb-rich foods, you're going to gain weight and gain fat. That model does not look like to be true in this well-designed randomized crossover study. Number two was the passive overconsumption model, that if you ate high-fat foods, you would end up gaining weight because you didn't know how many calories there were and because fat food would not affect satiety. And that did not hold true as well. But looking at this study, what can you walk away and which diet would be better to think about doing? So if you look at a diet that causes you to naturally cut down your calories and doesn't increase your hunger at the same time, that's what you really want. And a whole foods plant-based diet does that. In addition, if you look at the hundreds of studies that I have reviewed for you already that talk about the health benefits, whether it's brain health, Alzheimer's, dementia, whether you're looking at depression, cardiovascular health, heart attacks, strokes, you're looking at GI health, you're looking at kidney disease, and a myriad of cancers, all of those things, the risk is lowered by following a whole foods plant-based diet. So the bottom line here is a whole food plant-based diet is good for your health. It's also good for weight loss. It will help you to cut down your calories simply because it's nutrient-dense, calorie-poor foods, and it's an excellent choice for the environment and for the future of our planet. I want to thank you guys for watching this video. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.